I have a very special guest this afternoon, Bigtree. Del, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jason, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
I'm really glad you could make it. You know, we first started speaking a couple of weeks ago when we met at Anarchapulco, and I know you've been very busy. You've had the added, and I might add, unexpected issue of Adam Schiff smacking down your movie in what is basically the 2019 equivalent of a book burning. Can you give our viewers just a little bit of background? I'm not sure that everyone knows that you were the producer of the movie VAXXED.
Yeah, so I think VAXXED it's an interesting film because a lot of people credit it with sort of igniting this movement of vaccine risk awareness. There's been many great documentaries on the topic, and I think VAXXED is just one of them, but I think it happened to hit at the right time. And had sort of built upon a foundation that was already there, but it definitely struck a nerve. It got kicked out of Tribeca Film Festival, which I think really gave it press around the world, became one of the biggest social media stories in the world. But for people that don't know what VAXXED is, I was a producer on the daytime talk show The Doctors, the CBS talk show, for 6 years. I won an Emmy Award on that show, and celebrating the best medicine has to offer, the best, science, cutting edge technologies, new surgeries, things like that. And then I got a call from an inside source that said that one of the top scientists at the CDC is going to come forward in 2 weeks and say that they've committed scientific fraud on the MMR autism study. That's the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and autism. This was a study that took place between 2000 and 2004. So I got a tip off, as as a journalist or any producer that works on a talk show like that. You always have your sources, and when you get a lead, you jump on it. Well, the show didn't want to pursue that story, and I wasn't even sure if it was true. I just said, if this is true, I think we should cover this. We're a medical talk show. But they didn't want to challenge the CDC, which is what this was going to do, because the CDC was very supportive of the Doctors television show, and we got behind the scenes every time there's an outbreak at the CDC. No one wanted to ruin that relationship. But I also knew that our sponsors for the Doctors were a lot of pharmaceutical sponsors.
Right.
We would cut small interstitials and things, so it wasn't lost on me why we wouldn't touch the story. But then the story did break 2 weeks later. Dr. William Thompson's recorded voice was heard in multiple different statements, saying things like, every time I see an autistic child, I feel guilty. I feel like I'm a part of the problem.
Wow.
Essentially, Dr. Thompson had called a scientist, Dr. Brian Hooker, and started confessing essentially his sin, the idea that we put millions of children at risk, and 10 years after the fact, this is all happening in late 2014 into 2015, Dr. Brian Hooker started recording those phone calls. And that's what makes up the body of VAXXED, is these recorded phone calls of a top scientist laying out how they committed the fraud. And then he actually presented to 10,000 documents to that guy you just saw right there on your screen, William Posey. He's one of the congressmen out of Florida, was given 10,000 documents by Dr. Thompson. William Thompson, and that back up his claim and show the data that there was a risk of autism. And what he essentially says in the film, or what he says in the study, is that there was 3,000 kids in Atlanta that were used to study this issue, and the study was being done because of Dr. Andy Wakefield in the UK had made this assertion that there's a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. So our Congress asked the CDC to look into it. So this was the study they did. And what Dr. Thompson tells us, and he was the lead epidemiologist, he was the one crunching the numbers. He was the one actually doing the computer work to lay out the graphs. And so once they decided who they were going to look at, how they were going to structure this study, he went and started graphing it out and immediately saw that they had a problem. Because there's a large African-American cohort in this study, he just looked at African-American children. Was there an increased risk of developing autism if they got the MMR vaccine on time? And what I mean by on time is this was called a timing study. Everyone in the study was vaccinated. So you weren't comparing vaccinated to unvaccinated kids. You were comparing children who got the MMR vaccine on the CDC schedule between 12 and 18 months to those that had waited on the vaccine and delivered it after 3 years old. And what they found with that African-American group of children, that there was a 2.64 times more likely to develop autism if you got that vaccine when the CDC said to get it 12 to 18 months versus those that waited till after 3 years old. And then, you know, in science, you can have an anomaly. Something pops up, and but there's other truths about a situation that will sort of, weed that out. And one of them is that boys are more likely to develop autism. And so Thompson ran the boys, just the African-American boys. And it was exactly what we thought. It was even more increased. It went from 2.64 times more likely to 3.56 times. I mean, you know, you're talking almost 4 times the risk of autism.
That's a massive statistical significance in a study.
Massive. It was statistically significant. It was very powerful. And what Thompson ends up confessing is that we immediately tried to rearrange the study to ask different questions, to change age groups and everything in order to get rid of this signal, to get rid of this effect. Because, and what it leads to is the real problem we're having here, which is you have a conflict of interest in our health departments, especially the CDC. But for people that don't understand, you have Health and Human Services is sort of, I call it the mothership of our health departments, and under Health and Human Services is the CDC, the FDA, HRSA, and the National Institute of Health, NIH. And the CDC's job is to promote vaccines across the country, to end infectious disease by promoting vaccines. Perfectly noble job. I have no problem with that. I get it. We think that vaccines are a great way to stop infectious disease. So the CDC promotes it. And they also buy more than $4 billion worth of vaccines themselves and distribute them for the different programs across the country. So they're actually a marketing arm for the pharmaceutical industry when it comes to vaccines. They also now are carrying patents, and they're developing patents for parts of vaccines. So they're making money from the sale of vaccines. So all of this would be, I think, acceptable, except that then you take this group and you make them in charge of vaccine safety studies into investigating the safety of the product. And as Thompson describes it, and many scientists that have come out of the CDC explain the same problem, but he said, as soon as we started seeing an issue with the vaccine, the discussion became, if the public finds out about this, they're going to stop vaccinating, and we will go against our primary objective, which is to promote vaccination. And that dualistic, it's really been put on them. In some ways, I'm not sure I can even blame them for what they did, but what they did was they manipulated the study. That didn't work. They then kicked half the kids off the study. They cut about 1,500 children out of the study and reran the numbers to see if it would sort of disappear. And then when that didn't work, they ended up just manipulating what they wrote and avoiding parts of the conversation. And as Thompson describes it, one day after 4 years, they dragged a garbage can in the middle of the room, and they said, we have to destroy all the evidence of this study. And people threw their hard drives there and their documents. And that's why these 10,000 documents are so important that Thompson provided. What he said is, I saw that day coming. It was becoming clear that the fix was in, and so he had already stored them in a safe, and in 2014 decided to release that material. So all of that is what's at the heart of VAXXED. But when I talk about this conflict of interest, I think it's today there's a story that absolutely points out why this is a problem. We are seeing this Boeing 737 story, right, all over the country. 2 planes just crashed. Every article is saying the same thing, that the regulatory agencies allowed Boeing to do all of its own safety studies. And now that they're looking at the science around that, they're finding that Boeing had made some tragic flaws and mistakes in protecting themselves in putting this plane out. It's exactly how vaccines are being developed. They're developed by the manufacturers that's going to make billions of dollars on them. They're the only ones that would do the safety, and then they tell us they're safe, and the CDC and the FDA go, oh, great, you discovered they're safe. Let's go ahead and put it on the childhood schedule. I know that sounds crazy, and I know people say, well, Dell's exaggerating. I'm really not. That's exactly how it works. And in fact, if there's any issue with a vaccine, for instance, there's a court case right now in America by a whistleblower named Dr. Stephen Kraling and Joan Wielkowski, who came forward and said that several years ago, the FDA was recognizing that there was more mumps outbreaks happening in fully vaccinated communities. And so they went to Merck, the makers of the MMR vaccine, and said, we're really starting to be concerned about your mumps strain. We would like new studies to show that it's still efficacious because there's just so many people getting mumps. And Stephen Kraling was the lead of that study. And what he says is we ran the titer tests and the blood samples, and it was true. The mumps strain wasn't working anymore. And instead of admitting it or changing it, then Merck said, well, try some other things. Use rabbit's blood instead of human blood. So they ran the whole study with rabbit's blood. Like, for whatever reason, I don't know why that would work.
Vaccinate rabbits?
Right. I mean, so they tried all of these tricks, and then Stephen Kraling says in the end, they ended up just erasing numbers and writing in the numbers that they thought looked good. Wow. And now Merck has tried to have that case thrown out of court last year, and the judge said, no, it's going forward.
Well,
so
let me ask you this for a quick second, because this is a lot of information, I think, for people to absorb.
I'm sorry.
In a general sense, though, I think VAXXED was so powerful because what it said to me is that we've got this mainstream movement that, in a lot of ways and for a lot of topics, not just vaccinating, they want to make this into a very binary argument. Either you're on board with the program or you're anti-vax. You're anti-science, you're a climate denier, you're, totally in the conspiracy theory camp. But what your movie presented that was so eye-opening for me is that this is a much bigger and much more complex story. I think what I hear you saying, and I agree with this, is that any sensible person recognizes the value in vaccinating a population against dangerous and deadly diseases, but we want to know what the ingredients in these vaccines are. We don't want to just inject things into babies willy-nilly with no study. And some of the most important things that the film brought up were the Vaccine Injury Act of 1984, where under Ronald Reagan, vaccines were reclassified as biological instead of pharmaceutical. They were subjected to far less rigorous testing than something that would be injected into adult, let's say, as a pharmaceutical product. And this is something worth questioning. I think there were a lot of things done under Ronald Reagan's presidency, possibly, George H.W. Bush being the vice president, and there are connections to the pharmaceutical world with Donald Rumsfeld, Searle Pharmaceuticals. There's all these crazy backroom dealings that go on, and they don't want people questioning these things. They want vaxxed or anti-vaxxed. And the people that you're talking about, you're not talking about Jenny McCarthy and actresses or people in Hollywood who maybe don't have the scientific background to have mainstream credibility. You're talking about actual scientists within the CDC who pointed to studies, but yet people still treat you as a conspiracy theorist. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that, I've thought about that a lot because, I was a producer on a mainstream medical talk show. And now, though I have lots of people that follow the work I'm doing, and I do a weekly talk show called The High Wire online. You can watch it on Facebook every Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. But yeah, I'm called a conspiracy theory. And I thought about it. I mean, technically, every news story is conspiracy until you prove you're right. Woodward and Bernstein had a conspiracy theory that Nixon was trying to manipulate the presidency in the election. That's a conspiracy theory until you prove to be correct. And so I accept that we've made a bad statement out that is to try and just push news aside, and that is fake news. To sort of say that someone's a conspiracy theorist is a knee-jerk reaction. I simply say, and what I was trying to point out, and I sort of got off, but there are multiple whistleblowers now. There's like about 3 real whistleblowers all around that MMR vaccine, measles, and autism, and that discussion. Also in our film, we have Dr. Luc Montagnier. I mean, this is a man who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the AIDS virus. He's in our film saying this is a very real problem, the connection between vaccines and autism. So when I hear people say that VAXXED has been debunked, I have no idea what they actually mean. Do they mean because some somebody wrote an article from pharma that said that this stuff isn't true? Is that what we're calling debunked? Like someone just writes an article now? Because what's debunked? You have a very real whistleblower in Dr. William Thompson. He still works at the CDC. They didn't cart him off in a straitjacket. He's still one of the top scientists there, protected by whistleblower status. He still stands by the statements he's made. We've been asking our government officials to subpoena Dr. William Thompson and the other 5 scientists that were in the study, along with Julie Gerberding, who oversaw the study as the head of the CDC, who went on to become the head of Merck's vaccine department, to a multi-million-dollar a year job, and perhaps $100 million in stock options.
Wow.
After saying that Merck product was safe. So these are the types of things our government is supposed to be there for, as far as I was concerned. I mean, I'm a progressive liberal when I grew up, but now I'm much more into as little government as necessary so we can all walk amongst each other. But this is one of the places I actually think we need government. You're supposed to be investigating when there seems to be conflicts of interest and people claiming fraud, and there has been no investigation. Now, as far as, you had asked me about Adam Schiff. Well, now there's a call from our government official in Adam Schiff, who first started saying that Facebook should kick off people that express vaccine, they call it misinformation, but talk about vaccine risk or vaccine injuries. YouTube, he called on all social media to essentially censor free speech and to muzzle literally hundreds of thousands of mothers around the world who are all warning us that I watched my child lose the life that they had right before my eyes. Some of them dead, others in diapers all the way up to their adulthood when they were running around healthy kids at one point. So to watch a party I grew up in that used to say that women matter, that the mother matters, all of a sudden Adam Schiff and the Democratic Party are not listening to mothers. And I think it's time to start listening to mothers over pharmaceutical interested parties that are paying your lobby fees and are in there putting you in office. It's a very, very scary and dangerous time. I don't even if this wasn't, I don't care what subject it is, really, we have freedom of speech. And for government officials to try and end that freedom of speech, then ultimately he took another step and wrote a letter to Amazon saying you have to remove these anti-vaccine documentaries, and VAXXED got pulled down from Amazon. We had a lifetime deal to be on Amazon Prime for free. We were one of the top documentaries being watched in the world. And so now I would say anyone that's curious that hasn't seen it, the best thing you can do is you can either go to VAXXED.com, where you'll also see many of the interviews we did as we toured the country with the documentary. You can buy it there, or you can go to the website of the distribution company, which is VAXXEDthemovie.com, and purchase it there. And you can just stream it for a couple bucks, I think, on Vimeo, if you look up VAXXED on Vimeo.
But of course, attacking it on Amazon, Del, that's like going to have a serious impact on the number of people who get to see the movie. That, is definitely a major resource for people watching videos. And it's amazing that Adam Schiff is able to do this. He's very busily shutting down your movie. I haven't seen him doing any investigation into the multiple dead male prostitutes at Democratic super donor Ed Buck's house from crystal meth overdoses. That's something that we should probably learn some more about. Instead, he doesn't want people looking at your extremely valid information coming from scientists. It's amazing that he can just shut this down and take it away.
I mean, even you look at that party, I work a lot with Robert Kennedy Jr., who has put one of the most powerful family names on the line on this topic. I assure you, he did not come about deciding that easily, nor did I ever decide to come into this discussion. I do not want to sit here and tell you that the country I love and the government I love is lying to you, or that the pharmaceutical industry, which creates a lot of great products, and doctors that do great work are actually putting you in harm's way. That's an inconvenient truth that none of us want to be sharing with you. But Robert Kennedy is putting it on the line, and he reached out to Adam Schiff to sit down and go through the science, to go through where our information is coming. And I've said multiple times, I don't say anything I can't back up with medical certainty, either studies that come right from the CDC themselves, Health and Human Services themselves, publish medical journals like British Medical Journal, or the trials and the marketing information that the manufacturers provide us. That's where all of our information is coming from. Bobby Kennedy, a Kennedy, calls fellow Democrat Adam Schiff and says, I would like to talk to you on this subject. I don't think you've actually done your research. Adam Schiff is refusing to take that meeting.
Of course.
I don't understand that. I don't understand what's happened to, it's one thing to have an opinion. It's one thing to think you're right. But if we stop listening to the other side's perspective, that's the end of, it's the end of democracy, it's the end of humanity, and certainly it's the end of science.
Yeah, you've just hit it. And you also mentioned another topic that I wanted to raise with you. You stated it's an inconvenient truth to say these things. Now, inconvenient truth is obviously that film created by Al Gore that is most closely associated with climate change. Another topic that you're either on board with or a conspiracy theorist. Now, again, I think most sensible people are concerned if the mass industrialization of mankind over the past 100 to 200 years is in fact polluting our environment, making us unhealthy, causing death and increasing injuries and sicknesses, etc. But I question if carbon dioxide, which we exhale when we breathe and which trees and plants require to live, is the primary culprit that needs our attention. There's so little conversation about sulfur monoxide, about mercury in the ocean and in the air, about the aerosolized injection of aluminum into the ionosphere. Why are they so closely focused on carbon dioxide, and questioning anything about that makes you a climate denier? It's another situation where they just are desperate to shut down any debate, and this term settled science, Del, this is obviously, to me, a term that's been stolen or co-opted and twisted by lawyers. We've got settled law, but there's no such thing as settled science. There could be a discovery made tomorrow that would fundamentally change our understanding of the universe. How could it be settled science?
Science is one of the few places that statement absolutely goes against its core value. Science can never be settled, or it never evolves. And guess what? If you look through history, it's never the consensus that moves the science forward.
Right.
What moves science is someone that breaks out and discovers something new. Unfortunately, in history too, you watch an attack upon Galileo, an attack upon those scientists that say, hey, we're not actually the center of the universe. And discoveries like that, we attack them now because we have consensus thought. And though science would teach me in high school that there's no such thing as settled science, we tend to defer to this, this game of consensus, though somehow that weighs in. And I think it's where the Democratic Party really gets off when it comes to vaccines. They believe that the science is settled on climate science and that the body of evidence shows that the Earth is warming. And if that's correct, therefore, so are the consensus of science says that vaccines are safe. I think they're actually very different topics. And much like you've pointed out, we're all over the map. I'm not in one, you can't nail me down in a category on global warming, and you can't nail people down in a category. You pointed out that they say there's vaxxed or unvaxxed. It's just not true. There's people that simply think a hepatitis B vaccine is a stupid vaccine because they're giving it on the first day of life. It's a sexually transmitted disease, just like AIDS, that you won't come in contact with till you're sharing heroin needles or sleeping with prostitutes. So parents that have that choice and simply say, hey, I'm still down with measles and other vaccines, but this one makes no sense.
Yeah.
If they don't take that vaccine, in California, they'll call Child Protective Services on you and try to not let you out of the hospital without forcing you to get that vaccine.
Wow.
And if you don't, and if you manage to get out of that hospital, your child will be labeled as anti-vaccine, and you'll be anti-vaccine the rest of your life for choosing to opt out of one vaccine. So that's the problem with lopping everybody into one category. There's people that have spread their vaccines out. They're just taking a more delayed schedule. There's people that were totally pro-vaccine who watched their child's life destroyed. And I can't tell you how horrific it is, how many times I've interviewed people that 2 and 3 children on the spectrum before the doctors that misled them and told them it was everything but vaccines, finally came to the conclusion halfway through the vaccine program on the third child that it's got to be the vaccines. And so you have severe autism in the first child, severe in the second, and the third one's got Asperger's because they finally got it and stopped vaccinating halfway through. And then in some of these large families, they say, and then I had 2 children after that, not vaccinated, perfectly healthy, not a problem. And so those people are considered anti-vaccine. I think it would be much more accurate to call them ex-vaxxers. Wow. They believed in a program that hurt their children, and they've come to a different conclusion. I think in the beginning, and because of VAXXED, that was the body of the anti-vaccine movement, was really these ex-vaxxers who all flocked to that film. Every time I would show it, we spent a year traveling with the film, and I would stand in a theater and say, will everyone with a vaccine-injured child please stand up? And, for 3/4 of the audience would often stand up, 3/4 of them. And it felt like getting punched in the chest. The oxygen would leave the room. I had no idea in making the film that the issue was this profound and this prolific. One of the beauties of VAXXED is that those people found each other. You'd see them looking at each other in the rooms in tears and this cathartic experiences. They all went out afterwards and exchanged phone numbers. These people had been all alone in their homes suffering this tragedy, unable to go out because their child just can't be in public. Either the noises make them crazy, or they'll run into a street, or they'll do something inappropriate around a police officer. They get shot all the time. These are the types of issues that keep these people at home, and VAXXED help them find each other. And more, this story is finding all of us because autism continues to increase at a skyrocketing rate. And now more and more of us are either seeing it in our family or in our neighbor. And that's just a tragedy. This issue, this infection, this autism has gone from 1 in 10,000 children in the 1970s to now 1 in 36 children based on one poll around the country, or 1 in 45 is where the CDC is saying it's at. That's an epidemic. And the fact that no one in news is covering that. Instead, we're going to cover tens of people in Washington who have the measles. By the way, are you still waiting for someone to die? Because no one has died of the measles in America in 10 years, even though they scream and yell about these outbreaks. No deaths, tens of people, becomes a national crisis. But no one cares that 1 in 36, and since boys it's worse, it actually looks like boys may be being diagnosed around 1 in 22 to 1 in 24 boys are going to be being diagnosed with autism now. And no one's talking about that. That's nation ending. That's the end of the great American dream. And I am shocked that the best response that the medical industry now has is that autism's always been here. We're just diagnosing it better. Really? Okay, show me the old folks home filled with autistic people.
Yeah, I mean, you and I are approximately the same age. When I was a kid, I don't remember seeing that many autistic people around. And now I know so many people my age who have autistic children. It's astounding. And what you've just brought up is another huge thing. It's one thing that we have autistic children, but they obviously all grow into autistic adults, and we have this nation of, let's face it, incapacitated to some extent people who aren't able to care for themselves and drive us into the future. How is this issue, how does it play out in other countries? Is America uniquely susceptible to this?
Well, autism's a problem around the world. Everywhere where, there's large vaccination programs, it seems to be higher. You have statements from, you meet people in India that say we never had autism until the Gates Foundation brought us vaccinations. And now all of a sudden we have autism. You had a very interesting story when the Somali community moved from Somalia to Minnesota over a decade ago. They reported in Minnesota the highest autism rate we had ever seen at 1 in 35 children. Andy Wakefield went there and said, you guys may want to consider not vaccinating. There's something about your genetic makeup that's making you more vulnerable. So they stopped. And now all we hear about is the measles outbreak in the dirty Somali community up in Minnesota. Not a single journalist asked them, why are you not vaccinating? Or they'll say Andy is the one that told them to not vaccinate. But they will tell you that we never even had a word for autism before we came to America. We had never seen it. So they were bringing in witch doctors and things because they thought that the spirits had taken over their body. They'd never seen anything like it. And suddenly they had the highest rates in the world, no word for it. And when you want to watch how journalism's lying to you, we all saw that story break last year. And, oh my God, 45 people in the Somali community have measles. No one asked the appropriate question, which is, since they had the highest rate of autism ever recorded, what is the rate of autism amongst these kids that are now not vaccinating, that are getting the measles? Can we get that number? And when you ask, we actually asked the state of Minnesota and the health department, they said, we can't afford to do that study.
I see.
I want you to think about that for a second. Autism is one of the biggest growing epidemics in the world. The CDC and Sanjay Gupta and Rachel Maddow and everyone's telling us they're looking into this, they just can't find the answers. Mm-hmm. And you had a community in Minnesota that represented the perfect scientific study. Here's why. They ate the same diet. They had the same genetic makeup. So the control was perfectly designed. You could have compared people that live and have almost the exact same genetic code that got vaccinated versus those that didn't. To me, the CDC should have built an empire up in Minnesota, should have built one of the biggest autism centers in the world, because this would have finally gotten us to some answers we desperately need. And instead, the health department says no one is even going to fund a poll to see what the rates of autism are amongst the unvaccinated. That just tells you there's something else going on here.
And
they don't want answers.
It brings me back to something you've said earlier, is the statistical significance of the effect on African American males. We should remind people that Somalia is in Africa. So all of the Somalis in Minnesota are African Americans. I want to come back to Adam Schiff for a moment, because I've found this article here from a law firm. It's talking about lawmakers paid by Big Pharma to force vaccinations. And it's the first thing it talks about is the Disneyland measles outbreak, in which measles was mostly spread by vaccinated children. That's what you were talking about. But this is an interesting article for people to check out. It's the Orwellian title whitewashes the big lie. The Vaccines Save Lives initiative trumpets the lie that vaccines are 100% safe and effective. How could you even make such a general statement? I mean, vaccines, there are many, and each of them have different ingredients. So to say that it's 100% safe, I mean, that's obviously false. There could be any number of vaccines that have problems with them. But the lead liars are Representatives Adam Schiff, Charlie Dent, Thomas Marino, and Peter Welch. I think it's also interesting to note that when we go to opensecrets.org, one of the biggest contributors to Adam Schiff's campaign is the Walt Disney Company. Now, there's no direct correlation between a measles outbreak at Disneyland and Walt Disney being listed as second, one of the large contributors to Adam Schiff's campaign. But, again, when you say that Robert Kennedy Jr. has offered to meet with Adam Schiff and speak with him about science, and Mr. Schiff refuses, well, who is the science denier in that equation?
Absolutely right. I mean, I think that what they're trying to get away with is saying that there is no other side to this debate. This is the statement they're making, and that to take on the debate is to give it value. They'll say it's just like Holocaust denialism. When in fact, if you really look at this, it's very much the opposite is true. The real denialists is this medical industry that's making billions of dollars that is denying the story of the people who have been through this tragic experience. Going on millions of them around the world telling the same story. My child got a vaccine, had a seizure that night for the first time ever, fevers, started slurring their speech, stopped being able to speak, then lost the ability to walk and talk. And those stories are what make up VAXXED, and they're overnight. And then there's the stories that take longer. What happens if your child starts slurring their speech and losing their speech a month after a vaccine? Right. We're not even talking about those, and that could be the rest of them. But the point being is that to allow this industry to say we cannot be questioned, then I have this to say about that, that if there is no debate, if this is truly settled science, what you're saying is your science is immaculate.
Yeah.
It is, because there's no other scientific body in the world that would ever dare to make the statement, the science is settled. It's changing all the time. It's, but this one is. Okay, so to me, the bar is very low of what I would have to prove to get you to retract that statement, because you're saying it's immaculate science. And I'm saying I have eyewitnesses all over the world that tell a different story. And I've watched the medical industry take away the only culprit out of the lineup. If we watch really what's happened, if I look at this from a legal perspective, we took one culprit out. We said vaccines do not cause autism. We're looking at everything else. We're looking at genes, we're looking at air, we're looking at water, we're looking at food, environment. They're even saying it looks like it does have an environmental component. But in the 10 years that we've stopped funding, which is exactly what happened, VAXXED represents that study that's in VAXXED. This fraudulent study was the last study ever paid for by the U.S. government looking at a connection between vaccines and autism. So since 2004, when they tell you we don't want to waste money on that, they've wasted no money on it. They have put no money towards this, and we don't have a single answer from them. We still have Sanjay Gupta saying, we don't know what's causing autism. All we know is that it's not vaccines. Well, I find that interesting, that you took vaccines out of the lineup. You took the one thing that hundreds of thousands have pointed to with their own eyes, eyewitnesses. You know how strong eyewitness testimony is in every case? We have hundreds of thousands of people in this case, and that's the only thing that's been removed. Nothing has been put in its place, and now we're saying we just can't find the culprit. I find that to be extremely disturbing. That's just the beginning of it. But here are the issues. We have now proven that not a single childhood vaccine has ever been through the gold standard of safety testing, which is tested against a placebo control, meaning a control that got a saline injection. Not a single one of the childhood vaccines has been through that process. Most of the drugs you take have. So that's problem number one. Number two, there are actually injuries from vaccines. If you look at this one capture system we have, so imagine we have a product that we don't test for safety. Their defense of that is that it's unethical to do a safety test because it's unethical to have a group of kids not given this great new life-saving vaccine in a trial. To have them get a placebo just isn't right to them. So instead, our government says, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, says it's more ethical to give every child in the world a vaccine that's never been through a safety study.
Wow.
You can think about whatever you want, but the fact is it hasn't been through a safety study. So now we're going to have to look to the public to see, is there a signal? Is there an issue? Is there a danger that we didn't catch when we didn't look for it in the studies? And what you have is VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. This is the system in America that your doctor is supposed to report if you come in and say, my child's had seizures all night since you gave him the vaccine. That's supposed to be reported to VAERS. So here's the numbers we know. We know that in 2016 alone, that's the year we've really broken it down, there was 59,117 reported vaccine injuries. Now, when I'm told that vaccines, when I hear that leaders in the pro-vaccine movement saying vaccine injury is 1 in a million, and I think, geez, 59,000 reported injuries in 1 year. Does that mean there's 59,000 million people living in America? I don't think so. And then you break the numbers down and you find out that 432 of those were deaths from vaccines. Wow. 10,000 emergency room visits. Now, that's already a much higher number than I think anyone could say is acceptable. I don't think that's an acceptable number, but it actually gets worse, Jason. Health and Human Services manages the VAERS system. They're the ones in control of it, and they've done internal reviews. The Congress has come and done an internal review, and they brought in Harvard Medical School to see, how accurate is VAERS. And you know what they've discovered? VAERS is only capturing, this isn't Health and Human Services' own words, VAERS is only capturing less than 1% of the total amount of vaccine injuries.
Well, so people don't even know about it.
Right. Nobody knows about it. Doctors don't know about it. Doctors don't even know they're supposed to be reporting. Okay? So that means that in 2016 alone, if we're to take their word for it, it wasn't 59,000 injuries. It was 5.9 million vaccine injuries that should have been reported in 2016. 432 deaths becomes 43,000 deaths from vaccines.
Wow.
And 10,000 emergency room visits. If this is only 1%, becomes 1 million emergency room visits. So with numbers like that, I think that's a big enough question on this immaculate science to open it up to a debate. It is time to see, are these numbers real? What is really going on? You know, and then to top it all off, as you pointed out, in 1986, this product that doesn't go through a safety study, that is causing potentially 5.9 million injuries a year and tens of thousands of deaths, it's the only product that the pharmaceutical industry makes that you cannot sue them for.
Yeah.
You can't sue anyone that makes a vaccine, delivers a vaccine. You can't sue the doctor. You can't sue the manufacturer. You can't sue the Walgreens that gave you your flu shot. They are fully indemnified.
Right.
And then on top of that, it's the only product that's forced upon you. An unsafety tested, no liability product that's now forced upon you with potentially 5.9 million injuries in America per year. You decide if you think that that's something we should be. And I do interviews all the time. You know what they ask me? Well, Del, don't you think it's dangerous to be saying the things you're saying? Don't you think it's dangerous? Even if there are issues with vaccines, you're going to cause people to stop vaccinating by saying what you're saying. Isn't it dangerous? I think it's dangerous to not be investigating something that's potentially killing tens of thousands of innocent people every year in America.
Absolutely. You know, Del, something's occurring to me as we're speaking right now, because these things, they start out kind of as a war of words, right? We see Adam Schiff come out and say that you and other videos on Amazon are disseminating, you know, false information about vaccines. And someone could potentially take a soundbite of you saying something like, you know, vaccines injure people, and they could say, oh, look, he's anti-vax. What if we change the language to inadequately tested vaccines are injuring people? Because in the general sense, vaccine as an idea we like, but vaccines that the Ronald Reagan administration, the same guys who lied to us about what was going on in Iran-Contra, whose vice president, which was probably behind this in the first place, is smack in the middle of the Enron scandal and the war in Iraq, and his son was lying to us about weapons of mass destruction. So lying to us about things is nothing new to the Reagan, Bush, Clinton conglomerate. And I mean, let's not even talk about how the Clinton Foundation has used inadequately tested vaccines to disseminate all through African nations and Haiti and all kinds of countries where they've got a foundation that was never properly organized to do anything other than create a presidential library in Arkansas that now is promoting the sale of pharmaceutical products, something that is totally illegal for a 501c3 to do. And those are also inadequately tested vaccines created by a highly questionable, in most cases, pharmaceutical company called Ranbaxy that's outside of the United States, outside of any of this testing. I mean, those were the strongest points for me in VAXXED, that this law that got passed in 1986 created a windfall for the pharmaceutical industry to, as you've pointed out, develop all of these vaccines to give to a baby for diseases they are highly unlikely to encounter, like hepatitis B or C or whatever the vaccine is. I think B, right? Hepatitis B?
B is it, yeah, and they're working on a hepatitis A vaccine, which is equally as rare. Want to get that out there. You know, those are all really brilliant points. And, you know, one of the things that, there's a lot of things happening in the third world. I don't talk about the third world when it comes to vaccines. That's not the focus of VAXXED, not the focus of what we do. Those are different circumstances. And I hear mainstream media and science saying all the time, do you want us to return to to Rwanda? You want us to be like Rwanda? You want us to go back a century to when we were, and those are moronic statements. First of all, America couldn't turn into Rwanda if it tried. You know, you can't suddenly just remove our entire sanitation system, which was the greatest advancement in modern society, period. You know, they will say vaccines were the greatest invention of the 20th century. No, the toilet was. Not walking and drinking from rivers with our own, you know, feces. Not having horse manure running through our streets. You know how much disease disappeared because of that? That really is what we should be attributing this great modern world of health we see. And the question is not, it is noble to try and eradicate infections, but there is so much science now showing that they never achieved it without creating harm. And now all we're demanding is data collection. We actually cannot say that the risk-reward benefit works out. If you look simply at the numbers of the measles vaccine right now, nobody's died in 10 years from the measles itself, but 100 people have been reported dead from the vaccine. So right there, it's questionable. Like, what is the risk-reward ratio? We're taking on risks of vaccine injury with chickenpox, something we all had and know is absolutely benign. We're taking on risks with rotavirus. Rotavirus is, they will say, and this is what they'll say, 40,000 children die every year from rotavirus. What are you saying, Del? I said, yes, in countries where they're starving to death, where they have flies eating on their face. Yes, rotavirus is problematic. They have diarrhea, and any, diarrhea disease in a country where you don't have clean water and food can be deadly. In America, it's 3 or 4 days of your baby being uncomfortable and having diarrhea, and then fine, move on. They're drinking water, they're breastfeeding, they're going to be just fine. This is not a vaccine, they'll admit it. I was even at the Gates Foundation doing a tour, and they admitted that the rotavirus vaccine is really something needed in the third world. Here in America, we don't have a problem with it, yet we still vaccinate for it. Those are the types of things and discussions that should be having, and just simply not having.
Right.
And I think, as you pointed out, liability, taking liability away from this industry that lies to us all the time, is paying out billions of dollars in lawsuits all the time. They don't have a room full of angels that make vaccines. The same blood-sucking moneymakers that are out for their own good and well-being and try to destroy the credibility of any doctor that questions any product, whether it's OxyContin or Fen-Phen or Vioxx. Right. Always they attack the victims, and they attack the doctors that are trying to side with the victims. And that's exactly what's happening with this vaccine program. And to take liability away, I say this. If you're going to say that vaccine injury is really 1 in a million, I think the pharmaceutical industry could afford to deal with that. So why don't we put liability back on the industry?
Right.
And let's see what happens.
There's so many slam dunk conclusions that you and the other filmmakers who contributed to VAXXED came to in the film that it is mind-boggling. I mean, particularly with regard to this National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. The simple measure, if we do nothing else but modify this so that vaccines are seen as pharmaceuticals and require testing, even if it was in adults that they were tested in before they're given to children, that would be better than nothing, and eliminate, as you said, the indemnity from liability so that at least the pharmaceutical companies become concerned about it. The other point you raised was the woman who left the CDC and went to the multi-million-dollar job at Merck. These are undeniable facts that certainly would, I think, raise suspicion to the extent that it requires further investigation. Now, Del, you've got this Informed Consent Action Network. What can you tell us about that?
So this is a nonprofit I started after touring the country with VAXXED for about a year. We decided that, what's the next step? One of the questions that was happening, VAXXED is only about the MMR vaccine. And so many parents, we had a bus that was touring the country and said VAXXED on it. People would sign the names of their injured child or the family member that died from a vaccination. It became a traveling memorial with thousands of names all over it. But I started hearing people would come up and say, my kid never got the MMR vaccine. They got autism right after their DTaP vaccine, which you get earlier than the MMR. Or my child never got the MMR vaccine. They died after their flu shot. Wow. And it started bothering me because people would ask me questions in Q&As, is it just the MMR vaccine? Well, I wanted to investigate that. I also wanted an approach to start putting pressure on change, since I watched for that entire year this movie that was sweeping the world, and still our Congress refused to subpoena Dr. William Thompson, which is the only way to get to the truth. Refused to subpoena the 5 scientists that were involved in the fraud, refused to subpoena Dr. Julie Gerberding. And so for that reason, I said we need another mechanism. So we created the Informed Consent Action Network to do a deeper dive on the entire vaccine program, Every time someone says it's safe, I decided to spend the last 3 years with a brilliant team of lawyers, scientists, combing through every scientific study that our health departments point to when they say it's safe, to see how they're coming to that conclusion. We have been in an open debate. We wrote a 37-page debate to Health and Human Services explaining the problems we found. They responded earlier this year, or early last year, with their response and citations of studies. We read all of those studies, and now we've put forward, you can find it on our website, an 88-page document. That's ICANN's response to the Health and Human Services reply. And that lays out absolutely every problem. It's long-winded. It is not on a bumper sticker. If you actually want to understand the depth of this conversation, then read that 88-page document. Take a couple sittings because it's heavy. It's a lot of information there. We decided, you know, as much as I'm a media guy and I want it short and sweet, for those people that really actually want to understand the science and the issue, go to iCanDecide.org and read that. Also, we have a legal team that has been pressing lawsuits against government agencies, and we're looking to lawsuits against the pharmaceutical industry. And we won 2 lawsuits last year, one against the National Institute of Health and one against Health and Human Services. And we just settled a case with the FDA because we are laying out the fact that since you took liability away from a product that was being sued so much, the industry said it couldn't make money. That's why we took liability away. They actually blackmailed Ronald Reagan and said, we're getting so many lawsuits, we can't make money on this product, so if America wants vaccines, you better protect us from liability or we're going to stop making them. That's what happened. And Ronald Reagan actually didn't seem to like the idea. He felt blackmailed into it. He said he thought it would be problematic to have a product that would never need to go through a safety study if you couldn't be sued for dangers. But that is what happened. And so in that law, in the 1986 Act, it said that Health and Human Services would now become responsible for the safety of vaccines, and that they were required to work to make more transparency in the science, more scrutiny over marketing, and try to reduce the amount of adverse events. And in order to do that, the law says that Health and Human Services will have to meet every 2 years with the Congress, the Committee on Energy and Commerce, ironically, the one that just had a whole meeting about forced vaccinating the world. But anyway, they were supposed to meet every 2 years. So we put a Freedom of Information Act request forward saying we would like to see all of the meeting notes and the recommendations on how to make vaccines safer that have been happening at these 2-year meetings since 1986. And they didn't respond. They pushed back. We used an executive action, which is your next step in a FOIA, saying you have to respond. They didn't do that. We took them to court. And in that case, they ended up admitting and signing a document that they never met with Congress once. Not once, even though it was written into the law. Same thing with National Institute of Health. The National Institute of Health in the 1986 Act, the head of it is supposed to be in charge of a task force on vaccines that will use the head of the FDA and the head of the CDC. This group will develop studies and ways to alleviate the amount of damages happening from vaccines. Same thing, we asked for all of the recommendations they'd made to Health and Human Services that were supposed to be presented to Congress. They pushed back. We finally sued. Guess what? They admitted we never put the task force together. So the 2 elements of our government agencies that were supposed to take over and fix a problematic product that was being sued so much, this gigantic industry couldn't make any money off of it, our government didn't even do the jobs that they were required to do. So no one's looking at safety. No one cares about safety. Yeah. And your children are now a part of the largest human experiment the world has ever seen. And here's the point. They're failing. Everyone wants to tell me that, you know, look at what vaccines have done. I say, look at what they've done. We have the sickest nation of children in the industrialized world. We have more babies die on the first day of life in America than every other industrialized nation combined. We have more babies die in the first year of life than every other industrialized nation. Our children have gone in America from having 12.8% chronic illness in the 1980s, before we took liability away, when vaccine makers only gave us 10 vaccines by the time we're 18. It exploded, of course, when you take any liability away, and now our children get 72 vaccines by the time they're 18. At the same time period, we've gone from 12.8% chronic illness to now 54% of America's children have a chronic illness. Those are CDC numbers. I'm not making this up. More than half your kids are chronically, permanently, lifelong sick. 1 in 4 is on a drug they'll be on the rest of their lives. They're expecting that to climb to 1 in 2 in the next couple of years. And when you think about it, you know, we're seeing, and so what is chronic illness? It's either you have an autoimmune disease or a neurological disorder. And so when people say to me, well, you could blame a lot of things. You could blame our food, our water, our air, the environment, you name it. I said, sure. And I think we should be spending millions of dollars looking at glyphosate being sprayed on our food and fluoride in our water and 5G and everything else. But here's the point I think we've got to really look at. We're talking about a crisis of autoimmunity. Autoimmune diseases like we've never seen before, meaning that our immune systems are confused and are suddenly now attacking our own bodies. And I say this, if autoimmune disease is the crisis, shouldn't we be looking closest at the one product that's designed to alter our immune system for life? Because that's what a vaccine does. It alters your immune system forever. If you ask someone how it works, they say, well, a vaccine tricks the immune system into thinking it's had a disease. Okay. Well, we're not just tricking our child's immune system once on the day they're born with a hepatitis B vaccine, or 10 more times at 2 months old, or 20 times, or 50 times, 72 times. We are tricking our child's immune system with things like aluminum, neuroactive agents that send their bodies into allergic reaction, into, you know, swelling and inflammation and cytokine deliveries to the brain. More and more aluminum being found in the brains. We're inciting the system and confusing their immune system, tricking their immune system 72 times, and we're shocked that autoimmune disease is at a crisis point, that more children have type 1 diabetes than we've ever seen, more children have asthma, anaphylactic food allergies, multiple sclerosis, childhood leukemia. Yes, that's an autoimmune disease, folks. This is why we want to investigate this. And when the other side says there is no debate in the face potentially 5.9 million injuries a year, and that's just what we know. None of those people are claiming their cancer started from it, but a study could show us that. And here's how we fix it. Anyone who wants me to shut up, Jason, this is all I have to say now. Here's the one talking point. If vaccines are so great, then I need the health departments of the world to do one simple study. CDC sits on a database of 10 million people. Simply go into that database and compare vaccinated children to completely unvaccinated children. And let's do a health outcome study. Ask questions like who has more autism, who has more diabetes, who has more ADD, ADHD, who has more of all these diseases that are exploding our special needs classes, are costing our school system a fortune, are crippling our economy. Ask those questions. We asked the CDC to do that study, and they've been paid to do that study by our government for over 15 years. They said to us at the meeting we had at the National Institute of Health with Bobby Kennedy set up by Donald Trump, they said, we will never do that study.
Never.
I think you have to ask yourself why. That's the simplest study known to man. It would take a couple of weeks. In every database, we have databases all over the world. Why do they not want to do that study? Because they don't want you to know what the answer is. It's not about infectious disease. Sure, you can be afraid of measles. And I see these articles when people say, I'd rather have the autism than the measles, which just shows how shocking. You want to talk about misinformation? The fact that our news leaders and our pharmaceutical industry has convinced people that autism is such a non-event that you would rather have it than the measles, that just shows you what our industry is pulling off and why we need to step up and make a difference here. And frankly, laws. We're talking about taking away exemptions all over. This is what Adam Schiff wants to do. The AAP literally just said this in an article, I think 2 days ago, that of the top 10 goals they have, this is the American Academy of Pediatrics, their number one goal is to remove the religious exemption to vaccines across America. Whoa. Number one. The most important thing is to take away your religious right to say that I don't think I need to inject aborted fetal DNA into my child, mercury and formaldehyde and aluminum. I don't think that that's a choice the government should make for me. The AAP wants to make that the government's choice, which means your children are about to become property of the United States of America, in which the government overrides your parenting and your decisions and your thoughts. And if that doesn't bother you, also know that Healthy People 2020 is underway. This is a program written in Health and Human Services on their website that is a mandated forced adult vaccination program. You've got about 15, 20 vaccines coming your way. It's going to be forced by the government. So No matter where you stand on this, if you think it's okay that you will not have control over your own body, that your government will be able to inject you with whatever it wants, whenever it wants, however it wants, and go right ahead. Go ahead and support Adam Schiff and others like him that are trying to take your rights away as a citizen in a free country. I think that we should all be standing up against this. There's nothing, certainly not in this modern age where no one's dying of anything, then I don't think that this is the time to give away control of our own bodies.
You mean
this
we're
is
not
the biggest
suffering bubonic plague or anything on a mass
Correct.
scale where we
Right.
need to vaccinate everybody? That's shocking news. I hadn't heard about that Healthy People 2020. So you're saying the government's going to mandate that even if you're not a baby, you're going to get vaccinated for something. That is absolutely shocking.
Well, because in the end, if their system's going to work, it only works if everybody's using it. And they're getting away with a lie about herd immunity. I know I'm dumping a lot of information out there.
This is critically important, though, Del.
You know,
This is...
some of these things people lock on to, they don't. I have so much information I could talk for days. But let's address the one point that they're taking all of your rights away with, and that is the idea of herd immunity. They came up with this term for years and years and years and years. People were not vaccinating, sending their kids to school. The school would say, there's a mandate for the vaccines. They said, I'm going to opt out. And they say, well, but you're going to put our kids at risk. And the parent would say, not if your children, if you believe in vaccines and the fact that they work, then what are you worried about? And so they didn't have a way around that until they came up with herd immunity. This is something that really came out just a few years ago. It's a marketing scam. I'm going to show you why it's a scam. Herd immunity, let's look at measles. And these are all scientific facts. Anyone can look up anything I'm saying, or just go to iCanDecide.org and you will see all the citations to the studies I'm quoting and the CDC links. But when you look at measles, we know that it takes a 95% vaccine uptake in order to have herd immunity for measles, which is the current scare they keep using. Somehow they've managed to take what was once a Brady Bunch episode, and we were all giggling at a family that had the measles, to now it's like the Black Death. But anyway, 95% vaccine uptake. Well, they let you believe that that means 95% of the children need to be vaccinated, but that's not actually what it says. It says everybody needs to be vaccinated for the measles. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, well, I had my vaccine. No, here's the problem. The CDC schedule has 2 more adult MMR vaccines for you. Why? Because every vaccine they make wears off over time. In fact, that is one of the biggest lies and proofs that the science is not settled. Because when they first made an MMR, they said you would only need 1. Then you need 2. Now there's discussions of a 3rd one and go to college because the mumps strain is failing just like Dr. Stephen Kraling said it would. DTaP is proven to be almost totally pointless. We have a pertussis outbreak here in Los Angeles, all totally vaccinated children. So these vaccines are wearing off in shorter and shorter intervals, but a really long-lasting vaccine lasts 10 years. A lucky person might somehow hold on to titers for 20 years. So here's my point. When we say we need 95% vaccine uptake and somehow taking away the rights of these 2 or 3% of people, it's probably growing now, though. I'll bet you we're meeting 5 and 10%. Truthfully, are not vaccinating. We're going to say that they're to blame for the outbreaks and they're killing herd immunity. No, every adult, because I could ask you, I sat in a room in Mississippi with the health department. I said, here's the CDC schedule. It says that every adult needs 2 more MMR vaccines because they've worn off. So could every adult in this room, remember it's the health department and Congress and senators, could you please raise your hand if you've had your MMR vaccine in the last 10 years? You know how many people raised their hand? Out of 150 people?
0.
One little old lady had done it. 1 out of 150. No one has. Everyone listening to your podcast right now or your show is saying to themselves, that's true. I haven't had my MMR booster. Yeah. That means we are nowhere near 95%. If every adult has not gotten their MMR vaccine, we're somewhere around maybe 60% if we're lucky. And my point is this. They're going to use this against you. They're going to tell you this is why you need a forced vaccination program. But before you buy into that, ask yourself, where is the return of polio? Where is this big, terrifying return of smallpox? Where is the deadly measles outbreak that just sweeps the country and kills everybody? Because we've never had herd immunity. And those things that they tell us is why we need herd immunity have never happened.
Yeah.
There it is, herd immunity debunked.
You know, Del, it's such an important topic that you've been really a champion of for years now. You've dedicated your life to this. We're just about out of time for today, but I'd love to have you back. You've got an open invitation anytime there's anything you'd like to share with us. Just one question in closing. I know how you got into the role of producer on VAXXED. Is there anyone in your life or your family who is vaccine injured?
No. I have no injury in my family. My children are unvaccinated. That's something that, I'll travel around and the parents of injured children will speak to me as though I'm, a hero and that I have some altruistic nature, that I don't have skin in the game, and yet I'm here. And I appreciate that sentiment. But the truth is that having an unvaccinated child, or having a child that you desire to stay in control over, that is the skin of the game. That is what is under siege. The government wants control of my children. And just like our founding fathers, I believe this is one of those moments we need to reach down deep and say, they wanted freedom. And it didn't look good. The pharmaceutical industry looks huge. It looks like it's powerful. It looks like it's insurmountable. It's the #1 biggest lobby in Washington, outspending oil and gas 2-1. But I think about our founding fathers. I think about the biggest armada the world had ever seen. You had a bunch of farmers with pitchforks and axes, and they just said the chances look terrible. But they said, are we going to live on our knees or do we die standing? I think this is a moment we have to reach down into our DNA and say, this is not America, and I'm going to step up. I'm going to call my representative. I'm going to make a difference. We are being censored. I may not be here. I see that you have our website. We're building a website so we can stream the show at thehighwire.com. You can see it on Facebook right now until they censor us, but we are just about built. It'll be up and running and streaming our show and our network probably within the week. So go ahead and sign up with your email so that we can blast it out to you. We can let you know every time we're breaking news on this topic. And believe me, there's a lot of breaking news. I think this is the freedom fight of our lifetimes. And I've said this at places where we've met, in Acapulco, Red Pill Expo. There are so many great speakers looking at all the different lies and issues in our country. But this one, vaccines, I said it at, for the last year, this one's going to test our democracy and our freedom before anything else does. If you watch the news, this is the only story competing with Donald Trump in Russia right now. They want you to be terrified. They want you to give up your rights to control your body by making you afraid of a disease like measles, which is a non-event. It's a rash for 4 days.
Wow.
Don't let them do it, or you're going to lose everything else that this country represented.
So important. This topic is huge. Del Bigtree, thank you so much for joining me, Del, and we'll keep our eyes out here on thehighwire.com. You're doing tremendous work, and really thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Jason. It's a pleasure to meet anyone bold enough to be out there telling the truth. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you later.